Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today we're continuing with my Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless white and blue cards, and today we're taking a look at all the mono black ones. In this video I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on every card. If you aren't sure what the meaning of those grades are, you can find explanation in the description. Keep in mind this video contains my thoughts about the cards in this format before actually playing with them. I will undoubtedly get some things wrong, but as the format evolves, I'll talk about those things on the channel, mostly on my weekly vlog series called Nitsa Notes that comes out every Saturday. Also, keep in mind, we're only talking about limited here, not any other formats, and that means we're only talking about draft boosters. Alright, let's dive in with our first black card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. First up, we've got Assassin's Ink, which for 2 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. It costs 1 less to cast if you control an artifact, and 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment, destroy target creature or planeswalker. Obviously, this is premium removal. Even if you always had to pay 4 for it, you'd be playing it. So the fact that it lets you decrease the cost all the way down to only 2 mana in some cases is really nice, and it's going to be pretty easy to get it down to 3 mana consistently. It isn't easily splashable, which is a little sad, but it's still a great card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Biting Palm Ninja, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/3 human ninja at rare. It's got Ninjutsu for 2 generic and a black. Ninjutsu lets you return in a creature that has gone unblocked to your hand and exchange it with the creature with Ninjutsu, which comes onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. In this case, you pay 2 generic and a black to do that. Biting Palm Ninja enters the battlefield with a menace counter on it, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove a menace counter from it. When you do, that player reveals their hand and you choose a non-land card from it, exile that card. So at worst, this is a 3 mana 3/3 with menace. That's a very efficient creature, and this also comes with ninja and obviously ninjutsu upside, and both of those are well supported in the set. Removing a menace counter to take away your opponent's best non-land will sometimes be worth it, making this a creature that is also a discard spell, and that means it'll be a 2-for-1. That actually adds significantly to the board, and I like that. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Blade of the Oni, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 artifact creature equipment demon at mythic rare. It has menace, and the equipped creature has base power and toughness 5/5, has menace, and is a black demon in addition to its other colors and types, and it has reconfigure for 2 generic and 2 black. This looks very strong. A 2 mana 3/1 menace is something you would always play, so adding the powerful reconfigure effect here is great. 4 mana to turn any creature into a 5/5 menace demon is no joke, as that's the kind of creature that needs to be dealt with in most cases. That's going to be a significant upgrade for almost any creature. You can just keep putting it on things too if the first one dies. Feels like a bomb to me, though probably in the lower range. The main problem is sometimes you'll be upgrading like a 4/4 into a 5/5 with menace. That's not going to feel great, but still a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, we've got Chain Flail Centipede, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 artifact creature equipment insect at common. When it or an equipped creature attacks, it gets +2/+0, and it can reconfigure for 2 mana. This is a Grey Ogre who attacks as a 4/2 with some of this reconfigure upside, but I'm not ultra impressed with this as a creature or equipment. I mean, it's fine, but I think you end up cutting this more than you'll play it. It just isn't very efficient no matter how you use it, and the stats boost is only useful if you're the attacker. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, we've got Clawing Torment, which for 1 black mana is a common enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact or creature. As long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets -1/-1 and can't block. Enchanted permanent has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life. So this outright kills X1s and takes away the ability of all creatures to block, while also slowly bleeding the opponent out. If you're in a really aggressive black deck, I can see playing this, but in situations where you aren't the beatdown, it doesn't seem that good. Your opponent just won't always care about their creature getting a little smaller and being unable to block. It's notable that it is an enchantment you can keep around on the table for a while, and you kind of want to because it hurts your opponent, and that does go well in the black-white deck, which wants an artifact and enchantment to be around for various effects. Still, not that impressed here. I'm giving this a C-. It's probably mostly something that only makes the cut in really aggressive decks. Next up, we have Debt to the Kami, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says choose 1, target opponent exiles a creature they control, or target opponent exiles an enchantment they control. So keep in mind your opponent chooses what gets exiled when you use this, so mostly it will feel like a 3 mana edict effect, and those have waning value as the game goes on, and your opponent is more and more likely to have something very expendable to give up. It can be pretty potent early, and because you choose the option, you can at least choose the one that is the toughest for them to decide. For example, if they have only one creature or one enchantment, the choice is easy, but it's also pretty easy if they only have two or one of them, and so forth. The fact it's an instant also means you can deploy it at the exact right time a little more easily, but still, it's removal that you don't really have enough control over. It's probably just a C. Next up, we've got Dockside Chef, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 enchantment creature human citizen at uncommon, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to sacrifice an artifact or creature and draw a card. This looks pretty nice. The black-red deck is really about sacrificing stuff, as it often is, and you'll have plenty of things to sacrifice for value with the Chef, and there are other sacrifice synergies around too. It seems like a 1-drop that can really net you some serious cards in the mid to late game. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Dakuchi Shadow Walker. For 4 generic and 2 black, it's a 5/5 Ogre Ninja at common, and it has ninjutsu for 3 generic and a black. This seems like the kind of ninja you'll only end up with in your deck if you're loaded up with payoffs for ninjas and ninjutsu. It just isn't that great either way you play it, and I think most black decks have a good chance of cutting it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Dakuchi Silencer, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 human ninja at uncommon. It's got ninjutsu for 1 generic and a black, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may discard a creature card. When you do, destroy target creature or planeswalker that player controls. This looks pretty good. If you ninjutsu it in, you'll always have a card to discard to the effect. It is unfortunate you have to discard a creature, but it would probably be a little too good if you could just pitch lands and blow things up. But I like that no matter what, you're going to have a card in hand to discard to it if you ninjutsu it. It sort of makes it a Bone Splinters on a stick, which is pretty good overall. Obviously, if it's able to get in more than once, it can really wreck the opposing board. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Enormous Energy Blade, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +4/+0, and when Energy Blade becomes attached to a creature, you tap that creature, and it has an equip cost of 2. I don't like this very much. The buff to power is a ton and does make it so a whole lot of creatures can become good attackers, but because it taps the creature when it equips to it, you have to wait an entire turn to actually make that happen, and that's a pretty real cost, especially when you're already paying 3 to play and 2 to equip. This card has a bit of potential, as +4/+0 is a big deal, but I have a hard time seeing it work out. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Go Shintai of Hidden Cruelty, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 legendary enchantment creature shrine at uncommon. It has Death Touch, and at the beginning of your instep, you may pay 1 generic mana. When you do, destroy target creature with toughness X or less, where X is the number of shrines you control. A 4-mana 2/2 with Death Touch is not a great stat line, but obviously being able to pick off 1 toughness creatures when your opponent has one is going to feel pretty huge, and there will be some of those lying around. Once you get to where you can kill X2s with it because you have another shrine is where this will start to get crazy good. Like the other shrines in the set, the card is perfectly fine even if it's your only shrine, and I'm glad they designed them this way as opposed to the way we've seen them designed in the past, because yeah, the fail case of a 4-mana 2/2 that can trade with anything and pick off X1s is a pretty good floor, while the ceiling is great. I think this is probably a B-. Next up, it's Gravelighter, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 spirit and uncommon. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card if a creature died this turn. Otherwise, each player sacrifices a creature. So this is a Windrake with amazing upside. Most of the time, I think you would want to draw a card with it, as a Windrake that cantrips is awesome, but you won't always be able to set up situations where it does that, and having a symmetrical edict effect as a fallback isn't too bad. And in fact, in the earlier part of the game, like if your opponent has 1 creature, the edict on Gravelighter can feel pretty good. And that's kind of how this will shake out. It's harder to make something die early to trigger its card draw effect, but that's okay, because the edict will probably be pretty good in that situation, whereas in the mid to late game, things are a little more likely to die, and an edict effect is also probably worse. So yeah, this is a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hadetsugu Devouring Chaos, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/4 legendary creature ogre demon at rare. You can pay 1 black and sacrifice a creature to scry 2, and you can pay 2 generic and a red and tap him to exile the top card of your library. You may exile that card this turn. When you exile a non-land card this way, Hadetsugu Devouring Chaos deals damage equal to the exile card's mana value to any target. So this new Hadetsugu is a pretty big improvement on the original card. It has a pretty solid stat line and 2 great activated abilities. Giving up creatures to scry is sometimes something you need to do, but the other ability is the one that really pushes things over the edge. Not only do you get the chance to play the card he reveals, he also damages any target equal to the mana value of the card you exile. And in an ideal world, you can set things up with the scry so that it does something really significant. Now, it isn't all good. Paying 3 mana for the effect will mean that you won't be able to play the card a significant chunk of the time, and while you can use the ability at instant speed, you won't be able to play the thing unless you reveal an instant. Still, the fact that it lets you repeatedly damage things is big, and even if you never draw a card with him, turning the top cards of your library into burn spells is pretty good. And when you actually can play the thing and burn something, it's going to feel insane. In a lot of ways, he is a black-red-gold card, but because he's pretty good, even without the red effect, you can still take him really highly, and I think he's ultimately a bomb, especially if you can consistently use his second ability, giving him an A-. Next up, it's Rise Infiltrator, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 human ninja at common. It's got flying, and you can pay 3 generic and a black to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. If this format didn't have ninjutsu, this wouldn't be that good. It doesn't have the best starting stats, and the ability to buff it, while sometimes useful late, isn't very efficient. However, in a world where you want to play an early evasive creature that you can use to get in with a ninja, well, it's a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Invoke Despair, which for 1 generic and 4 black is a rare sorcery. It says target opponent sacrifices a creature. If they can't, they lose 2 life and you draw a card. They repeat this process for an enchantment and a planeswalker. This has a tricky mana cost for limited like all of the Invoke cards, but there's a decent amount of common fixing in the format, so they're not impossible to play. You probably do need like 12 black sources to feel reasonably good about casting this often enough. And the nice thing is, if you do cast it, it's pretty powerful. Your opponent will almost assuredly have a creature to sacrifice to this, and maybe also an enchantment in this format, but they're definitely not going to have a planeswalker, or almost definitely not going to have a planeswalker. So you get some nice value out of this where they probably give up 2 permanents, lose 2 life, and you draw a card. So yeah, you get a 3-for-1 whether or not your opponent has all 3 permanent types, and that flexibility really makes this a really good edict effect, a really good version of one because it does so much at once. There is still the fact that your opponent will likely have some expendable creature, but the rest of the card helps balance that out. The mana cost does hold this back, but it's still pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Joon, the Midnight Sky, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/5 legendary creature dragon spirit at mythic rare. It's got flying and menace, and when it dies, you have 2 choices. One of them is each opponent discards 2 cards and loses 2 life, and the other is put target non-dragon creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. You lose 2 life. Like the rest of this cycle, this is crazy good. A 5-mana 5/5 with flying and menace is efficient and incredibly difficult to block, so your opponent better kill it. But if they do, well, you get to reanimate the best creature from your graveyard. Now, that creature probably isn't quite as good as Joon, but it's still super powerful nonetheless. The discard effect is generally going to be less good, but if your opponent is low on life, or you don't have a creature to bring back, you'll choose that option. This is an absurd bomb. I'm giving it an A+. Next up, we've got Kaito's Pursuit, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says target player discards 2 cards. Ninjas and rogues you control gain menace until end of turn. This trend of them giving us mind rots that do some other small effect continues here. Paying 3 to make your opponent discard 2 is usually like a D+. It gives you a 2-for-1, but you also don't add to the board, and it can be a pretty bad top deck in the late game. If you're in a ninja deck, which will usually mean blue-black, the fact that this gives menace to some of your creatures is pretty nice. If you're in black in general, you'll be hard-pressed to not end up with at least a few ninjas, so I think you end up playing this in black a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it is Kami of Restless Shadows, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/3 spirit at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. You return up to 1 target ninja or rogue creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or you put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. If you aren't returning a ninja or rogue to your hand consistently with this, it's going to be much worse. Putting your best graveyard creature on top of your library is nice, but not nearly as good because you aren't actually gaining a card. You're just doing some card selection, and that is a massive step down from getting the card to your hand. Returning a creature to your hand is likely to give you a 2-for-1, while that's not possible if you're putting something on top. Obviously, if the creature you put back is a bomb or something, you'll still be pretty happy. But if that's all this is doing, it probably isn't worth it, as a 5-mana 3/3 is an ugly stat line. For that reason, I do think this needs a build around grade. It's probably only a D in your typical black deck in the format, but I would value the first copy as a C+ in a deck that has 7 or more rogues and ninjas. Next up, we have Kami of Terrible Secrets, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/4 spirit at common, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control an artifact and an enchantment, you draw a card and you gain 1 life. A 4 mana 3/4 is not a great stat line these days, so you're going to want to be drawing a card off of this around half the time for it to be worth it. And that's not going to be automatic in every black deck in the format, since you have to have both an artifact and an enchantment. It's certainly easier to do that in this format than in most, but if you're in, say, blue-black ninjas or the black-green graveyard deck, that's not something you're going to be focused on. In a lot of ways, this is a black-white gold card, because that's the deck that has a whole bunch of reasons to get both an artifact and an enchantment into play. I think this is probably a D in your typical black deck in the format, and a C+ in black-white. Next up, we've got Leech Gauntlet, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/2 artifact creature equipment leech at uncommon. It's got lifelink, and the equipped creature has lifelink, and it can reconfigure for 4. A 2 mana 2/2 with lifelink always makes the cut, and this one can reconfigure to give something else lifelink later in the game. It's a little sad it doesn't also give it some stats boost, but the idea is that you'll have something sizable enough to put it on late, and if you don't, this just can sit around as a reasonable creature. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Lethal Exploit, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. It gets an additional -1/-1 until end of turn for each modified creature you controlled as you cast this spell. 2 mana for -2/-2 at instant speed isn't premium, though it can kill a lot of stuff reasonably well, and you can even use it combined with a block to take something down, though that's always a lot riskier. That said, I think you'll be able to do -3/-3 with this often enough that it sneaks into the lower B range. If it was always -3/-3, it probably would be a B, and sometimes this will be even more than -3/-3, though I think we do have to accept the wide range of outcomes with this, and the fact that -2/-2 is going to happen a significant chunk of the time. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we've got Life of Tashiro Umazawa, which for 1 generic and a black is an enchantment saga at uncommon. Its Chapter 1 says, choose one. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, or you gain 2 life. And Chapter 3 says, exile this and return it to the battlefield transformed. And it comes back as Memory of Tashiro, an enchantment creature human samurai that's a 2/3, and you can tap him and pay 1 life to add black mana to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery. So this is a really sweet saga that turns into a creature. Chapter 1 and 2 are nice references to Umazawa's Jite, and once it transforms into a creature, it's a nice reference to Tashiro Umazawa. But even apart from the fun references, this card is good. Chapters 1 and 2 give you options between the different modal Jite effects, and they're pretty spicy. On some boards, this will allow you to outright kill 2 creatures with the first 2 chapters. On boards where you can't do that, this will often allow you to attack with a creature who couldn't before, and on boards where you can't do either, gaining a few life isn't a bad consolation prize, especially because it turns into a reasonable creature in the end. I think this is going to be worth first picking pretty often. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got the Long Reach of Night, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say, each opponent sacrifices a creature, unless they discard a card, and Chapter 3 exiles the saga and returns it to the battlefield transformed. In this case, it becomes Animus of Night's Reach, a 0/4 enchantment creature spirit with menace, and when it attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in defending player's graveyard. I never love effects that give opponent a choice between things, especially when the options are discard or sacrifice, because there are many board states where doing one or the other is no problem for your opponent, and because they have a choice, this means Chapter 1 and 2 won't always feel great. That said, there will certainly be times where it is a pick your poison option for your opponent, and they just can't choose something that's great for them, and because you're doing it 2 turns in a row, you're more likely to produce that situation at least once. The creature you eventually get can be pretty tough, and Chapters 1 and 2 do make it pretty likely that there's at least a few creatures in the graveyard. I think this is a C+. Next up, we've got Malicious Malfunction, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. It says all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. If a creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Cheap board sweepers like this can be pretty awkward and limited. Most decks have a decent number of creatures who will die to it, so finding an opening to cast it where it's purely beneficial can be hard. Still, it is one of the best possible ways to deal with an aggressive opponent, and casting it in those situations can be completely game-ending. A card like that mostly feels like a sideboard card to me. I think it's probably a D+ in your typical limited deck, and a C+ out of the sideboard. Next up, it's March of Wretched Sorrow, which for X and a black is a rare instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of black cards from your hand. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way, and March of Wretched Sorrow deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life. This is premium removal. It won't always be super efficient. In fact, it usually won't be, because you have to spend 1 more mana than the toughness the creature has, but the fact that you can gain that life back is a big deal. Casting this for 6 to kill a 5/5 is going to feel incredible, especially at instant speed. Like with all the marches, you probably don't want to actually exile cards to cast it that often, but it does give the card some extra punch, and there will be situations where it makes sense to do it, like if you need to exile a card to do enough damage to kill a blocking creature, or to enable you to play another powerful spell on the same turn. This is a B+. Next up, it's Mugatai Ambusher, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/2 artifact creature rat ninja. At common, it's got ninjutsu for 1 generic and a black, and it has lifelink. This is a solid little ninja if you're in the market for those. The ninjutsu is very nicely costed, though keep in mind that you have to return a thing to your hand, and that does make it a little less efficient. And really, either casting this a normal way or ninjutsuing it isn't going to feel amazing. It does have lifelink, which means it's a good creature to modify. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mukatai Soul Ripper, which for 1 generic and a black is a 4/3 artifact vehicle at rare. When it attacks, you can sacrifice another artifact or creature, and if you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains menace until end of turn, and it has crew too. The mana and crew cost here is pretty reasonable, especially because sometimes you can give up a creature to make it bigger and harder to block. I'm not sure you want to be doing that a whole lot, since if you can't crew this, what's the point? And if you're sacrificing creatures, that will become harder. But you can sacrifice artifacts, which if you have, random ones lying around, it can be pretty good. And if you have expendable bodies, it can be too. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Nashi, Moon Sage's Scion, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 3/2 legendary rat ninja and mythic rare. It's got ninjutsu for 3 generic and a black, and when it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of each player's library. Until end of turn, you may play one of those cards. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its mana value, rather than paying its mana cost. So if you can hit your opponent with Nashi just once, you're probably going to be pretty happy with your investment, as he effectively gives you an extra card that you can cast for free, and it does reveal a card from your library and your opponent's, so it's likely you will hit a real spell. Because he has ninjutsu, making that hit happen is easier than it might be otherwise. He doesn't have the greatest stats, and he has no evasion beyond ninjutsu, so getting him in more than once might be hard to do in a lot of games, but that first time he hits your opponent is going to feel great, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Nozumi Blade Blesser, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 rat samurai at common. It has Death Touch as long as you control an artifact, and Menace as long as you control an enchantment. If you can give it either of these keywords, it'll feel okay, and if you can give it both, it will feel formidable. Menace and Death Touch are pretty nasty together, since you can kill both things that block it. I think it has a high ceiling, and it will be easy enough to get at least one of those keywords that I think it's a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Nozumi Prowler, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 artifact creature rat ninja at uncommon. It has ninjutsu for 1 generic and a black, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature you control gains Death Touch and lifelink until end of turn. This is pretty nice. The thing I really like is that it's good whether or not you're ninjutsuing. A 2-mana 3/1 that gives Death Touch to something when it ETBs is just a good rate, especially when you're also adding in lifelink. It'll enable you to attack a lot more effectively. You won't always be able to take advantage of it, of course, but most of the time it will change how your turn goes. Then, adding the ninjutsu angle is a big deal, because you can use it to give Death Touch to one of your block creatures out of nowhere. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Okiba Reckoner Raid, which for 1 black mana is an enchantment saga at common. Chapter 1 and 2 say each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and then it transforms with Chapter 3 into Nozumi Road Captain, which is an enchantment creature rat rogue with menace. It's a 2/2, and vehicles you control have menace. Giving us a 1 mana saga like this is pretty cool. You obviously get insane value for the investment of 1 mana, as you drain 2 life and get a 2/2 with menace that gives vehicles menace. This is going to feel like a pretty great turn 1 play, and even in the late game this can do some serious work. The life drain helps you survive until it becomes a creature, and it's great that as soon as it transforms you can send in a vehicle that's hard to block. Having to wait for the body a couple of turns is going to be a little frustrating, but I'm pretty impressed with this overall, especially for a common, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Okiba Salvage, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says return target creature or vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then put 2 +1/+1 counters on that permanent if you control an artifact and an enchantment. We see 5 mana reanimation spells a lot, and they tend to be kind of mediocre. This is because you don't often have something in your graveyard that's worth paying 5 mana to reanimate. In other words, you not only need a large enough creature, it also needs to be in the graveyard, and that is not a situation that will just happen. When you add +1/+1 counters to the mix like this does, it does become easier to feel like you're getting your 5 mana's worth out of the card. However, you do need to have an artifact and enchantment to get those. I would be much happier with this card if it gave you 1 +1/+1 counter if you had an artifact, and another if you had an enchantment, but it's all or nothing, and that certainly hurts it a little bit. Even in a format where it seems getting one of each is fairly doable, in the end, I think this is probably just a C. If you have a couple of crazy good bombs, it does get better than that. Next up, we've got Reckoner's Shakedown, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player discards that card. If you don't, put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature or vehicle you control. This is a pretty neat take on a coercion effect, as it's effectively a modal card that either takes away your opponent's best card, or it gives you a look at your opponent's hand and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on one of your creatures or vehicles. Individually, those two effects are probably about a D. The discard effect only allows for a 1-for-1 trade and doesn't change your board at all, while putting 2 +1/+1 counters on a thing for this much mana at sorcery speed is really clunky. The discard effect is also pretty close to a dead card in the late game, and that means having the other option will matter more late. So I think if you take these two situational D cards and put them together, you probably end up at a C-. You'll cut it a lot, but it seems like you'll play it enough for it to be a C-. Next up, it's Reckoner's Bargain, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. You gain life equal to the sacrificed permanent's mana value. Draw 2 cards. These types of effects tend to do okay, especially in decks with a sacrifice theme, which in this format mostly means black-red. It's sort of an instant speed tormenting voice in the sense that you give up 2 cards to draw 2 cards. It's just that one of the cards is an artifact or creature in play. Using this in response to a removal spell or to get rid of something expendable will always feel nice, but there are also situations where you can't find a spot to use this because you just don't have the resources to make it worth it. The life gain is nice, but I don't think it powers it up a ton. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Return to Action, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains lifelink, and when this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Black often gets this kind of trick that returns a creature to the battlefield when it dies these days, and they tend to be alright, although I prefer them when they cost a single black mana. Still, this one does actually increase your creature's power, which means you can use it to help you take down the other creature in combat a little more effectively, and it will even gain you some life. It's useful against removal too, of course, but it's still situational enough that I'm not super high on it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Soul Transfer, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery, and it says choose one. If you control an artifact and an enchantment as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Exile target creature or planeswalker, return target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. This is great. Even if you never have an artifact and enchantment together, you have a 3 mana spell that can exile any creature. That's the mode you'll almost always choose if you have to choose, though having the other option tacked on is great. When you do have an artifact and enchantment in play, this will feel insane as you'll get a very efficient and powerful 2-for-1. If you were always getting the 2-for-1, I think I would say this is a bomb, but as it is, I want to keep it at a B+. Next up, it's Tatsunari Toad Rider, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/3 legendary creature human ninja at rare. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, if you don't control a creature named Keimi, create Keimi, a legendary 3/3 black and green frog creature token with, whenever you cast an enchantment spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And he has an activated ability where you can pay 1 generic and a green or a blue, and Tatsunari Toad Rider and target frog you control can't be blocked this turn except by creatures with flying or reach. So this 3 mana 3/3 has a ton of upside. If you can manage to cast an enchantment, you're going to end up with a 6/6 worth of stats that is very difficult to block, and that even drains your opponent when you play enchantments. It's definitely kind of a build around as it really needs enchantments to excel, but because it has such a reasonable baseline, you can even play this in a deck with like 1 enchantment and feel fine about it. and this set has a lot of enchantments, so getting enough of them in your deck isn't a very big ask, especially in black-white. If this ends up being even easier to get going, I think it's a bomb, but I do think the setup is enough that it falls a little bit short. But yeah, it is a very reasonable floor and an impressive ceiling. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Tribute to Hirobi, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say each opponent creates a 1/1 black rat rogue creature token, and Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed. It comes back as Echo of Death's Wail, a 3/3 enchantment creature spirit with flying and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of all rat tokens. Whenever Echo of Death's Wail attacks, you may sacrifice another creature, and if you do, draw a card. This is a weird card with a cool design. Giving your opponent a couple of 1/1s is not usually something you want to be doing, and there will definitely be times where your opponent can utilize those tokens a little too effectively. In fact, because you want to gain control of them when you get Echo of Death's Wail, your opponent knows you probably aren't that interested in blocking them, so they're likely to chip in for a few damage. And if your opponent blows this up after Chapter 2, you're going to really feel bad. However, if things go according to plan, and I think they will more often than they won't, you eventually gain control of those rats and get a 3/3 flyer with haste who can sacrifice a creature to draw a card. That's insane for the amount of mana you invest. And yes, like with all of these sagas, you're sort of stuck in a situation where you aren't sure you can beat the clock, but this one is cheap enough to cast and has such a powerful ceiling that I really like it overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Twisted Embrace, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact or creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1. This is a really good common. 4 mana to kill a creature and give +1/+1 to one of your creatures is a good deal. Now, the downside here is that your opponent could blow up whatever you target in response, which will be backbreaking, so it's sort of like a black fight spell in the sense that you need to pick your spot carefully. When you do, though, it will feel amazing, and you can also choose to put it on some random artifact instead of a creature where maybe you don't get the +1/+1 bonus, but it's less likely your opponent can kill it. It's also an enchantment, which this format cares a lot about. This will be premium removal for any deck, and the black-white deck can get the most mileage out of it. This is probably black's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Undercity Scrounger, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 artifact creature human rogue at common. You can tap it to make a treasure token, activate only if a creature died this turn. This gives black some access to fixing and ramp, which it doesn't always have, and that's nice, but the stats are underwhelming and the death requirement won't always line up for you. I think this is probably just a C-. Next up, it's Unforgiving One, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 spirit at uncommon. It's got menace, and when it attacks, you return target creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the number of modified creatures you control. This is a very powerful modification payoff. Now, if you've only got 1 modified creature, it isn't going to be able to do a whole lot, but with 2 or more, your chances of reanimating a creature are pretty reasonable. This has a fine baseline as a 3 mana 2/3 with Menace 2, which also makes it easier for you to attack with it more than once. It also means that Unforgiving One is also a good creature to modify in the first place, and it does count itself. I do think that it requires enough setup that it isn't something you take super highly, but I don't think you cut it for most black decks either. I'm giving it a C+. This will definitely move up, perhaps even as high as a solid B if it turns out that it's easier to get modifications going in black than I'm thinking. Next up, it's Virus Beetle, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 artifact creature insect at common, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. I always have a soft spot in my heart for Ravenous Rats type cards, and that's what we have here. Adding to the board and taking something away from your opponent's hand isn't a bad play in the early to mid game, though it does get less impressive late. It's an artifact too, which is of course useful. I'm giving this a C-. And our last black card is You Are Already Dead, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. It says destroy target creature that was dealt damage this turn, draw a card. This has a really interesting design. I'm normally not big on this type of effect, as actually doing some damage to something for this to actually kill the thing usually takes up resources, including cards, so spells that can only remove damaged creatures are often not good. However, in this case, they lowered the mana cost to 1, and they added a cantrip. At that point, we're talking about a card that I think is a decent playable. Keep in mind that it does need a damaged creature to target, so it isn't really the kind of cantrip you can cycle whenever you want. You won't usually generate a 2-for-1 with this because of the resources you gave up to damage the creature in the first place, but the cantrip pretty much makes up for that, and on occasions, when you can get a 2-for-1, this will feel incredible. It is still super situational for a removal spell, but it's definitely priced to move, and I think you'll end up playing the first copy in most black decks. Playing more than one is probably asking for trouble due to its situational nature, though, giving it a C. Well, those are all the black cards in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Tomorrow I'll take a look at all the red ones. If you disagree with anything in this video, let me know in the comments. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and a lot more content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to make sure you are caught up on the set review so far, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.